Discerning truth in a sea of lies. Live from Kalispell, Montana, it's Critical Disclosure Radio with your host, Jim White.
Okay, this is indeed Critical Disclosure Radio. Thanks so much for joining us here today on this, what is this, the 13th day? Let me cut this red pill feed. 13th day of April 2022. And we're delighted to be joined with you here today on a variety of different networks, including Brighteon Radio. And I am joined by a co-host. My co-host today is Kirk MacKenzie, been on the broadcast many times, founder of Constitutional County, Defend Rural America, and is a true patriot through and through. And we're delighted to have Kirk co-hosting with us today. And our guest today, we're honored to have Lieutenant Colonel Matt Lohmeier on with us today, and we're going to give him a proper introduction. Matthew Lohmeier is a public speaker, author of the best-selling book Irresistible Revolution, Marxism's Goal of Conquest and the Unmasking of the American Military, and founder of the Save American Military PAC. He's also the host of the Matt Lohmeier Show. His book Irresistible Revolution was published in May 2021, at which time Matt was a respected active duty commander in a newly formed U.S. Space Force. For publishing and speaking about his book, then Lieutenant Colonel Lohmeier was relieved of his command and subjected to an Inspector General investigation launched from the Pentagon. He subsequently joined the nation's biggest media personalities to discuss the proliferation of Marxist-rooted critical race theory in the military and its divisive impact on the force and mission. Matt separated from active duty on September 1st, 2021, and is now a highly sought public speaker and consultant on matters of Marxist ideology and tactics, CRT, the betterment of military culture, and the preservation of our liberties. Matt has 2 master's degrees, a master's in military operational art and science, and a master's of philosophy and military strategy from the School of Advanced Air and Space Studies, considered by many the Defense Department's premier strategy school. He lives with his wife and children in Idaho. Lieutenant Colonel Matthew Lohmeier, thanks so much for joining us here today on Critical Disclosure Radio.
Happy to be here, Jim. Thanks.
It's great to have you. It's great to have you. Well, I'll tell you what. Let's start here. Let's start with the big picture, and we'll move more in towards the specifics. If you can, give us just a little bit of background on your. Now, Kirk here before the show had talked about how he's sort of brought up in a military family. Of course, you're in the Air Force as well. Give us just a little bit of perspective on your background, and let's talk about the Space Force, because that's a very interesting. It's a very interesting area of the military for me, and then we can go right into the Marxism. Over to you, Matt.
Yeah, thanks for asking those questions up front. I think context is important, and a lot of the time I have the opportunity to do something like this, people don't start out by asking about the Space Force, the newest branch of the military, and that's actually important context as well. A lot of people you'll hear talking about Space Force will call it Trump's Space Force. Usually it's the left that'll call it Trump's Space Force, although I'm sure he likes to take some credit for that as well. But the fact is, the idea of an independent branch of the military for space had bipartisan support for a number of years before actually the Trump administration had come to office. It just so happens, though, that President Trump was willing to honcho that effort, and he had a space nut junkie vice president in Mike Pence, who absolutely loves space. And so that was voted into law in December. It became a new branch of the military in December of 2019 after a bipartisan passing vote in the Congress. And so it's not just something that a president can make happen. It requires a congressional vote and support. But I served for over 15 years, predominantly in the Air Force. I flew for the Air Force as a T-38 instructor pilot and was an F-15C air superiority fighter pilot and flew F-15s in Japan, and then transitioned into the Air Force space community and did space-based missile warning. We've historically been concerned with intercontinental ballistic missile detection and reporting, of course. And then there are new and emerging weapon systems or missile threats that we, of course, are very interested now as a new service. And I was in command of a space-based missile warning unit at the time that I ended up writing that book that you mentioned, Irresistible Revolution, for which I was fired.
Wow. So basically, are you in essence a whistleblower? Do you have like a whistleblower status? It sounds like you blew the whistle sort of on the military, and they didn't like that. But are you officially, quote unquote, a whistleblower? Are you considered that, Matt?
You know, I'll tell you, to be honest, I don't know the answer to the question. It was really interesting at the time that I was fired. It was May 2021. almost a year ago now. And it was interesting to see who threw that term around. The term was thrown around again. Things are highly politicized, of course, and I attempted to be apolitical as a uniform wearer, but people on the right were interested in labeling me a whistleblower because they thought it would offer me some kind of legal protections, and perhaps it would. But the left was interested in calling me a whistleblower because they thought it would be damaging, or an insult that Lieutenant Colonel was interested in tattling on his superiors or senior officers. I saw that rhetoric coming from both sides, but I suppose in one sense, you could say that I blew the whistle, but I did, and I want to make it clear for your listener and viewer that I actually tried to use my chain of command to express my concerns about what was unfolding in the military, and specifically in my own unit and at my own base, long before I ever had any thought that I'd be writing a book and talking about it publicly. I used the chain of command, and then I filed a formal written complaint with the Space Force Inspector General's office that's never been public until later this week. On the first episode of my show, The Matt Lohmeier Show, I read the entire text of that formal written complaint in its entirety so that the American people can be aware of what was going on and what I was informing my chain of command was going on before I finally decided, I need to put this in a book and get the word out. Otherwise, we're doomed. I mean, if chain of command can't take any action to hold political activists accountable, and in this case specifically, it was left-wing radical Marxist political activism, and a lieutenant colonel in command of a unit isn't able to do something about that, well, then how on earth are we to expect that our military could ever return to being apolitical? And so I figured Congress needs to be involved. The American people and the taxpayer and the people who elect our elected officials need to be involved and aware and educated of the problems we're facing in the armed forces if we're ever able to make any headway. And so that was kind of the underlying motivation for actually writing a book. It was a failed attempt at reform from within, and then needing to bring in some external pressure, as it were.
Yeah. So back to the if we come back to the Space Force,
yeah,
that was, like you said, it was started by Trump, and they like to claim it's them. Was that started, Matt? Because I mean, is that where the next battlefield is literally going to occur? Is in space? I mean, I know there's, the whole Star Wars and things like that back in the Reagan era, and I don't really know. Apparently, that never went through. I kind of suspect maybe it did. I wasn't there, but is that sort of the next frontier? Is that so? It sounds kind of Star Trek-y. Is that the next frontier? Is space? Is that why they're putting so much money into space weaponry? Is it like attacking satellites? Are they going to be attacking other ships in space? I mean, what kind of battles are they planning on here?
Those are fun questions, important questions. We could spend the entire time on, but I'll try and be brief in how I answer the question. All throughout the Cold War, as the threat of intercontinental ballistic missiles and other weapons developments transpired. Of course, you mentioned the 1980s and the Reagan administration and the Star Wars program, also known as the Strategic Defense Initiative. Even as early as that period in history, there were advocates for, although they were far and few between, there were advocates for standing up an independent branch of the military to honcho national defense efforts from that domain. And many experts for a long time have considered space itself an entirely separate domain from the domains of air, in which we have an independent branch of the military, the Air Force, and the land and the sea. But that never really gains traction. There's a commission, a 1999, I think it was, Rumsfeld Commission report that was accomplished essentially to determine whether or not the Air Force as a department was actually being a good steward for all things national security space. And that report comes out, and it's somewhat biting or damning of the stewardship the Air Force had over space. And frankly, it had conflicting interests between some of the air domain capabilities it had in development and space domain capabilities it aspired to develop. And there was a single hierarchy or leadership or command in charge of making those budgetary decisions, for example, and adjudicating between the capabilities we were developing in either of those domains. And so there were some recommendations in that report about how to fix that, but then 9/11 happens and we end up in 20 years of conflict in the Middle East, and space, in one way of looking at it, kind of falls by the wayside. And it hasn't been until the Trump administration that we were willing to take the idea of an independent branch of the military seriously once again, for the very reasons you've mentioned. There are looming and growing threats to our national security in that domain, and from that domain, and through that domain. And of course, there are many spacefaring nations, but it's nations like Russia and China, particularly, that are of most concern to a country like the United States. And in 2015, both of those countries developed what would be their equivalent, essentially, of a space force, although it's not called a space force. But they've taken, especially China, the space domain very seriously. They've met a lot of their objectives, their aims, their goals, and what we call cislunar space, that involves even the surface of the moon and some of the orbits or Lagrange points around the moon in the past couple of decades. And the United States is just finally recognizing that if we don't take this very seriously and allocate the appropriate funding for some of our space efforts, we're going to find ourselves pretty quickly, if we haven't already, on the backside of a power curve relative to China.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. I'm going to hold off the break until after the bottom of the hour. When did it start going wrong? I mean, we used to be the greatest fighting force in the world, and now the leadership of the military has gone woke. I mean, just the mere thought, and this is nothing to not trying to disparage transgender people. Each their own. You want to do what you want to do. That's fine with me. But that's got to weaken. I mean, these are not seen as strong, fighting a macho, strong fighting force. I mean, it makes us look a little bit ridiculous, if you want to know the honest truth. When did that all start, Matt? Do you have any idea? When did it start going wrong? I mean, what happened?
Yeah. There are a number of ways to answer this question. There are things you can point to, which I won't talk about, within the Clinton administration, that I've only, I never paid attention to this stuff years past. It's only been the last couple of years I've really tried to dig in and answer this question, that have to do with political correctness and some changes we were making in regards to policy within the Defense Department. And then once again in the Obama-Biden administration in 2011 specifically, there was something that was stood up called the Military Leadership and Diversity Commission, I think is what the acronym stands for, MLDC. It was something that all of our service members were unaware of was even taking place, but a few individuals in the Pentagon were working on recrafting the language of DoD policy, instructions, regulations, etc., and across all branches of the military to redefine terms like inclusion and diversity and equality. And as you're aware, the radical left and Marxist ideologues specifically are one of their primary strategies is to usurp language, to slightly redefine terms, and then to weaponize language in order to abuse other people.
That's right. You're exactly right.
And so that begins in the Obama-Biden administration in 2011, unbeknownst to our service members. I didn't hear about it, never learned anything about it, never experienced any trickle-down impact of those changes until years later, because it takes a long time for some of these policies, once codified, to then trickle down into formal trainings and things. But I'll tell you a recent turning point that both the American people and our service members can frankly turn back to is the death of George Floyd. It's like the seeds for a long time had been planted for activism, for wokeism, for Marxist revolutionary impulse and spirit. And it wasn't until you saw on social media and in mainstream media, Black Lives Matter, smashing windows, getting a lot of funding, chanting for cities to burn to the ground. Melina Abdullah, the Los Angeles chapter organizer, saying the revolution has begun. That kind of rhetoric started to spread all throughout. Now, it wasn't for the first time, but with a whole new resurgence of energy after George Floyd's death, and our military service organizations and military service members, some small percentage of them who are activists, we were not any different than the broader American society in that regard. So the preponderance of the people want to get about normal business, including our military service members. They want to remain apolitical, for example. And yet there was an activism that had grown up nearly overnight. And it came both from the top down. Senior military leaders were taking to official videos in uniform saying, "I am George Floyd." I'm a Black American first, a service member second, injecting race identity politics into the lowest levels of the military. And then you had some of our youngest service members parroting that on their social media accounts, actually criticizing the sitting commander in chief, President Trump, for example, things for which you should actually end up out of uniform or punished if you don't cease and desist. That was all going unchecked. And those like me that were interested in stopping the politicization of our military we're living in a kind of constant fear that you could be labeled something awful for speaking up about it, something like racist. You're a part of the systemic institutional racism problem in this country. You're an oppressor because, after all, you're white and you have privilege, and you're participating in an oppressor class against a much smaller minority oppressed class. All of those Marxist talking points you began to see showing up in various places throughout the Defense Department, but even, unfortunately, specifically in formalized trainings that we were then receiving, both at my base and throughout the Defense Department. It was like it had been planned long in advance and with the right. Now, that sounds conspiracy theory-like, and so I don't want to necessarily insist that it was all planned, but it sure seemed apparent that for a long time this was in the making. Policy had been crafted, trainings had been crafted, so that when you had the right trigger events, it was like it was all ready to just dump out onto the active duty service members, fundamentally transform, to use that phrase, the culture, and to create a climate of fear so that you could essentially get what you needed to get out, reshape human behavior and the thoughts of our service members, and weaponize language in a way that you might cause fear in the ranks so that people don't actually speak out against it.
Yeah, well, I'll say it. Yeah, it was all planned. I mean, come on, it seems apparent to me.
That's right.
Kirk, do you have any questions that you want to throw over to Matt?
Well, I think that's really, how it started. It really goes back even before then, because they started to try and, the affirmative action. I think that people don't realize feminism was a communist front. And that sounds like a radical statement, but that's true. And they basically started to affirmatively go after white guys. I remember the term was male chauvinist pig when I was in college. And it just got worse from there, toxic masculinity and so forth. And so people don't understand communism is a racist movement. And it absolutely hates white civilization because it's Christian. It first and foremost hates Christianity, but the bearers have been, white civilization. And so they're taking us down, and they're taking us down by getting half of our population to suppress the other half, using federal money to do that. So it's been going on for a long time, but I think you're absolutely correct that the George Floyd trigger event was a manufactured event, I think, in a great extent, and it's just a pretext to go ahead and do what they finally wanted to do. And Obama came in, and he was affirmatively, I was watching it, they were taking in Black women into the military, into the training classes, into the schools, and then shooting them right up the ranks up to the top levels and so forth. And they're picking people who are communist Marxists, ideology, and they're anti-white and so forth. And I don't mind talking about racism because you have to, it's the way it is. And so there's a mass movement to displace Western civilization, and largely because, our values are Christian based, which is basically things like equality. And,
right.
And we are very fair people. And so we believe in those things, and it's all part of the attack. I think that Americans should be absolutely shocked at the idea that our military is being taken over, because then what defense do we have? And it was really, there was the unpublished thesis that was done by Hillary Clinton, and both her and Obama. And I think both of them had the same thing, that they said the only way you can take down America is from within. And there was really a concerted effort to start pushing people out that were patriots and bringing up people that were not, and largely recent immigrants who really didn't have the cultural values and so forth. And it really accelerated, and they are pushing them through everywhere, businesses and military and everything else. But the idea that the military is being overthrown in that regard is absolutely should shock the minds of Americans. Are you, So what is it exactly you're going to try and do to help to turn the tide? I know you said that you have a book out. What else are you, I know you're doing this, you have a radio show. How do you see this as turning this around, if it's even possible?
Yeah, well, I appreciate what you've said, and I want to say before I mention what it is exactly I'm trying to accomplish, I'll say that I agree with you about feminism. There are a whole host of studies that have appeared in the university campus setting that I'd never heard of before, like queer theory, and there's fat related theories and LGBTQI plus whatever, all these theories, and I first learned about them from actually James Lindsay in his book Cynical Theories. Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay did a whole thing on this that I use in writing my book. But I was shocked to see that a lot of the social, cultural related gender studies, feminism studies, all of them are rooted in a Marxist impulse in the university setting with the explicit aim of undermining Western civilization. I mean, it's remarkable if you actually get into the details of who it was that founded those. So in answer to your question, what I'm trying to accomplish is essentially educate the American people about these issues. And I don't think that's possible with one person alone. And that's one of the reasons I felt like, I didn't want to write a book. That's hard work. I was an active duty commander at the time. I like to read books. I didn't really like writing one, but I thought, if it gets some attention and we can start the dialogue, then it's one more issue we can bring to the attention of an American people who sense that their liberty is slipping away, who want to do something about it. I talk to some people who say, I read your book, service members included. I read your book. It's phenomenal. It's so important that I learned some of the history behind what's going on. And I bought extra copies to share with family member or friends because they need to hear it as well. And so on the one hand, I think people are becoming better educated, which helps us tackle any number of these problems from the local level, like you yourself are trying to accomplish. But on the other hand, I'm surprised at the continual pushback from people once they learn that this is a big problem and how it's rooted in Marxist ideology. For example, our senior military leaders, who I really hoped when they came to understand some of the political ideological roots of the current social justice activism, that they'd absolutely put an end to it in the armed forces. And either they're willing participants in it because they believe in it, and that's a smaller number in my opinion, or they're largely afraid to try and take a stand against it because they see what happens to people like me, or they're the ones who held me responsible.
You get canceled from life is what happens. They cancel your life.
From life. So I think one thing that's clear about the 20th century Marxist revolutions that have taken place throughout the globe is that preceding all of the destruction of the ordered civil society that occurs is a climate of fear. People are paralyzed. They're afraid to speak freely. They're afraid to hold these activists accountable. And so it doesn't take a majority of the population to push the agenda in order to steamroll the entirety of society. In fact, it can be quite a small percentage of the people who are bullies, who are mean-spirited, and who insist on the certain agenda playing out. And if the American people and the service members, part of to whom I wrote the book, remain apathetic or unwilling to speak out boldly for their principles, their values, which shouldn't be partisan. It's not partisan to speak out in defense of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution as a military service member, although they're throwing around terms like patriot extremist now to label such people who one, distrust the current approach or path of government, and two, insist that we've got something noble worth hanging on to, such as the Constitution Declaration. If those people aren't willing to stand their ground and say, no, this is nonsense, we're going to remove politicization from our armed forces, then yeah, we will lose our military. I mean, that you can't stand for this kind of thing and hope that you're going to keep an apolitical force who maintains its lethality, its readiness, and so on and so forth.
Well, I'm afraid that it leaves us vulnerable to outside countries. I mean, empire and conquering other nations is something that's been going on since the beginning of time. I'm just afraid it's going to embolden some of these other countries that may have been thinking about, maybe we can pull it off. Maybe we can take down the giant. And now when they see that the military are like going LGBT and going woke, that's got to, in some sense, I'm afraid it emboldens our enemies to maybe even step up their plans or maybe actually try to carry them out. Is that something that concerns you as well, Matt?
Well, it's a possibility, of course. The heads of state and the military leadership across the world, especially for our great powers, pay attention to this kind of stuff, just like you are. And if it wasn't for the international community's response to Putin right now and the potentially crippling situation he and the Kremlin have put themselves in, and the way in which the West is responding, I'd be concerned that Xi Jinping would be potentially taking action in Taiwan even now. But it's not the threat of U.S. military force any longer that stays Xi Jinping. It is the broader international community's response to what they see happening in Russia, Ukraine. That's an entirely different subject to unpack, I know, but it's not us that's necessarily a deterrent on the world stage, and we have been for a very long time, especially since the end of the Cold War, and really ever since the end of World War II. But I just saw the Space Force put out a new tweet from their official account. I think it was last week, where they're interviewing another lieutenant colonel who's a guy become a woman. Long hair, earrings, they won't let you grow a beard because that's unprofessional. But they'll let the man become the woman and use taxpayer dollars to give him hormone therapy to do it. So that I think the undersecretary or assistant secretary of the Air Force in the Pentagon, a female, was interviewing this transgender lieutenant colonel so that they could put out a professionally done video in support of transgenderism from the Department of the Air Force and from the new Space Force. And I think, what kind of messaging are we sending to the world, to your point? And beyond that, what kind of divisive forces are we setting afoot within our armed forces that are actually far more likely to be the swift unmaking of our military than even a foreign enemy, in my opinion?
We got about 3 minutes before we have to take the network break. So rather than sort of dig into something that's going to take a bit of a time to flesh out, why don't you let us know, Matt, when is your podcast starting? I know Matthew Lohmeier.com is your website. Tell us how people can find out more about you. Where can people find your book? Do you have any speaking engagements coming up anytime soon? We'll just pack that in here in the last couple of minutes.
Okay. Yeah, the show is the Matt Lohmeier Show. It'll be available on video, YouTube, Rumble, and whatever other video platforms there are. But it'll also be available for people to listen to on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and all the other favorite podcasting platforms that people listen to. They can go to MatthewLohmeier.com, and the last name is spelled Lohmeier, MatthewLohmeier.com, to sign up or subscribe to email regarding that podcast. But the first episode is actually going to air tomorrow. I recorded it about a week and a half ago, but I mentioned the formal written complaint that I submitted to the Space Force Inspector General's office that I've never made public before, and they're under obligation to never make it public. I'm not. I've left out the names of the individuals involved, of course, in that complaint. I'm not vindictive, but I've read the entirety of that. So for what it's worth, the content will be incredibly valuable. It'll probably be a little bit boring and tedious because I'm reading it, but it's about 40 minutes worth of really important information about some of the activism that was occurring in fall of 2020 when Trump was on his way out of office, and in the beginning of 2021 when the Biden administration took office. And I spell all that out in this complaint. My complaint was dismissed, by the way, by the 3-star who fielded it. They sat on it through the election season, November, December, January. Imagine once January 6th happened, I got a written response essentially dismissing the complaint. But yeah, that's where people can go to find more information, MatthewLohmeier.com, and you can find links there to buy the book as well, Irresistible Revolution.
Great. And you speak regularly. Do you have any speaking engagements coming up?
I do. I've been speaking almost weekly this past couple of months. My next event I'll be speaking at is an event called Rock the Red out in South Carolina, Greenville, South Carolina. Rock the Red event, and you can Google that and it'll show up. But that's I think the weekend of 5, 6, 7 May.
Nice.
And I'll speak maybe on the 6th. Friday the 6th.
Folks, we're just out of time on this segment here. We're going to take a network break for about 3 minutes. When we come back on the other side, we'll pick up our conversation with Lieutenant Colonel Matt Lohmeier. I am joined by Kirk MacKenzie, who's co-hosting with him today, the founder of the Constitutional County, and been a patriot for a long time and been a co-host several times on the broadcast. So always delighted to have him here. You can check out what we have going on over at criticaldisclosure.com. Criticaldisclosure.com. We'll be back after these brief messages. Okay, folks, thanks for hanging on to the break. I'm your host, James White. If you're not set with precious metals, now's probably the time to do that. As you can see, if you're following the news, I should say, you can see the dollar is getting taken over in other parts of the world. They're replacing the petrodollar with, looks like a gold-backed currency, perhaps. Who knows what the future holds? But I do know that 10 out of 10 fiat currencies eventually collapse. So to protect your wealth, it'd be a good idea to pick up some precious metals. You can do so at Carla Johnson's website at 7kmetals.com/Carla J, 7kmetals.com/Carla J. You can call Carla at 406-855-2761. You can get hooked up with the program where you can have precious metals delivered right to your mailbox every single month, and you do not have to fight the traffic at the metal store. So check it out, 7kmetals.com/Carla J, and all the proceeds and all the support you give our sponsors helps this broadcast. Okay, thanks for hanging on to the break. We are back here with Lieutenant Colonel Matt Lohmeier and Kirk MacKenzie, who's co-hosting with us today. Thanks so much for joining us here on Critical Disclosure Radio. Let me make sure that I have your gentlemen, make sure I have all of your, okay, you're off mute. Good. Matt, let me start with asking you this. You know, you hear all the time, Russia, 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 Russia. That's been the constant mantra here for the last 3 or 4 years. Let me ask your assessment, just being in the Space Force and being in the being in the Air Force and the Space Force. What is the biggest threat right now as we sit here today? What is this, the 13th day of May, 2022? Is it China? Is it Russia? Or is it forces within our own government that are Marxists that are trying to push this agenda forward? I mean, what I'm saying is, if we have to put our attention and our time towards tackling this three-pronged problem, let's say we have, should we focus our attention on the leadership here in this country, or do we have to worry about China invading us or Russia teaming up with China and launching nuclear missiles? What's your thought on that, Matt?
Well, you want your military to be able to nearly exclusively be able to focus on those external threats like Russia and China. And what you heard out of our current Secretary of Defense, unfortunately, if you were in uniform anytime in the past year and a half, is that we've got some really serious national security threats that we ought to be zeroing in our efforts on. This came in written formal memoranda to the force: white supremacy, the global COVID-19 pandemic, and global climate change. Those are the greatest threats to U.S. national security, which really made our service members scratch their head and think, really? I might be new to this. If you're a young guy, I wouldn't have guessed those. Or if they'd been around a while and had actually been focused on what some of our serious peer competitor threats are from a military capabilities standpoint, then they knew better. But the fact is, your question implied something that is absolutely right. And it's that we've always possessed, frankly, any civilization in human history, this is probably true for, inherently, we've always possessed the capacity to destroy ourselves from within if we're not extremely careful. And that's why Reagan and others have repeated what he said, but that our liberty or freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We have great capacity to wreck everything from here at home, unfortunately. And the kind of divisive, polarizing rhetoric, emotional, visceral response to some of what people read about and see happening in the country at the federal level, and even unfortunately at the local level, depending on where people live, is the very kind of things that unmake a country from the inside out. And when we divorce ourselves from our undergirding Judeo-Christian value system, we leave a gaping black hole into which any other political ideology or religious cult like wokeism can infiltrate or fill that space. And you end up kind of reintroducing a kind of segregated tribalism into society again. It's the kind of thing that's existed all throughout human history, for which people are willing to get angry and kill and die for. And so, I speak all around the country, as we mentioned before the break, and even, there's the conservative audiences to which I speak are not exclusively, but largely Christian and activist in nature. Certainly, they believe in the Judeo-Christian values on which our country was founded. They're starting to wake up to this problem. I mean, they're starting to see that, geez, we're really setting ourselves up for a kind of tribalism here, and this is looking scary. It's looking dangerous. So how do we unify as a people? How do you first unify as a conservative base, and then hopefully, Joe Biden and his administration might in fact be the greatest impetus for some of the left to unify with us come election season.
Yeah, that's a true statement
later
right
this
there.
year and in 2024, because he's sure doing himself disservice nearly every day.
Kirk, over to you, brother.
I think on the unification, that's a really good point. It's something that I'm after for a long time. And it's really a tough deal. But I think that we have to start with how we identify ourselves. And I think that has to change because, we tend to identify ourselves as Americans. And that really no longer holds. So, their weapons are division, defamation, and destruction. and they are very successful at it. And they basically have gotten Western. They're a few people that are getting us to destroy ourselves by splitting us into halves and then having the two halves set off apart, against each other. So it's very important how we view our identity going forward. And I would argue that we shouldn't think of ourselves as Americans anymore. It's really, truly Christianity, if you will, versus, enlightenment versus dark ages. I mean, it's almost Luciferian versus God. And when you really get to analyze it. And that means that we need to really understand that a lot of the countries that we westernized are in the same boat we are. It's not just Americans that are under assault, although it certainly is. But, we got Japan, we have Korea, South Vietnam, we have India. I mean, Australia. There's other countries that are also, but those are Western. I'm saying there's also non-Western countries that are right in there with us. And I think we have to reshift our identity and really begin to set down any racial differences or ethnic differences or whatever else and begin to embrace a different way that we identify ourselves. And also we need to understand that the method that they use is they essentially take Christianity, they've analyzed the components of Christianity, and then they find everything that's non-Christian. And so what they do is they elevate those. So there's two ways you can attack something. You can either shoot for the bullseye, in which case it's very visible, the arrows, you're shooting at the bullseye. The other way is you just promote everything around the bullseye. And that's what they've been doing. Homosexuality, transsexualism, Black, they want to define it as a racial issue, white versus dark at this point. They used to be white versus Black, and then they decided to kind of bring in the Chinese and everybody else. Well, now all of a sudden there's people of color. That's how they want to define it. I think we have to reshift our identification and going forward and realize how they're doing this is to promote non-Christian, they take these non-Christian elements, if you will, and give them something. And then they, it's crazy to have a Mexicans who are extremely Christian are fighting, basically voting for a Democrat Party and communism because they want immigration. It's pretty interesting. So they have an odd coalition, I think, that's very weak if you actually begin to take a look at the pieces of it. But we have to identify, in my opinion, and I'd be interested in your comment, I think we have to reshift the way we identify.
Was that addressed to Jim
comment, Matt? No,
to you, Matt. I'd be okay. Either one of you.
He doesn't want to hear from me. He doesn't want to hear from me, Matt.
All right. Go ahead. You've got a lot of great thoughts there. It's a lot of great thoughts. You mentioned that it's not just in Western civilization that we see this very same phenomenon occurring, and so I won't say improve upon, but I'll add something to what you've said. There are many non-Christian countries in which freedom-loving peoples right now find themselves at odds with a kind of authoritarian or totalitarian government impulse that's wedded with big tech and unelected officials, some elite class, think global reset or think, it actually is, if you understand what China's system of government and economy has looked like, and why, despite their communist ideological underpinnings, they've been successful. It's kind of a two-tiered socioeconomic system in which there's a kind of elite class on top who becomes, monopolizes wealth, and then it's socialism for all the rest, kind of down below. And there's an effort underway to kind of reshape the international community in the likeness of something that's far more Chinese, where some elite class is going to prosper or benefit by the changes, and the rest of the globe can be better controlled and subverted regardless of their religious preference. I happen to know, in fact, he's the only guy I know on active duty who's had his request for accommodation from the mandatory COVID vaccine approved. He's an atheist, and he requested accommodation for his vaccine from getting the vaccine because of ethical veganism. That was approved by the Defense Department, but there are literally thousands of Christians now saying
ethical veganism?
I'd never heard of it.
Are you joking? Ethical veganism?
Here's what's interesting. He's a fierce patriot. He's very conservative. He's atheist. He's a good friend of mine. And I think he frankly, this shouldn't go on any official record. Of course, this is my personal view. He probably hadn't heard of ethical veganism either until he was searching for some reason to not get the vaccine.
That's funny. But
that's what the DoD approved. But all the Christians, any other religious accommodation request that was submitted in the past several months has been denied almost exclusively. There was essentially a standing policy. It's like, we'll deny any religious accommodation request. But yeah, I don't think you're wrong in teeing this up as the quintessential battle between good and evil. We're seeing that play out right now across the globe, and it's not just in Western civilization, although from its inception, the Marxist revolutionary spirit had as its ultimate aim the dismantling of the Western Christian nations, the destruction of the capitalist nations, the free market system. And I've got a book, I think it's behind me or it's at home, called Letters to Americans, and they're letters from Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in the late 19th century to their comrades in Western Europe and in the United States, with their aims to completely undermine the religious institutions, completely undermine the education system, completely destroy the presidency and the Senate. Those are their terms, not mine. The presidency and the Senate in the United States, by even running for office if you need to infiltrate the system. This is over 100 years ago they were writing these letters. And so this, even though we tie some of the evolution of these occurrences or phenomena to the last half century during the Cold War and in the education system, these plans have been afoot for a very long time.
You know, Matt,
I would
go ahead.
Let me just say on this, it's been in foot for a couple thousand years, to be honest.
That's right.
And so what happened is, here, take a look. I'm going to reframe all these wars. This is something that came along. There's a series of epiphanies I've had over the last 40 years. And one of the epiphanies was all these separate wars that we think about are actually just one war. And that is the war they would like to call the New World Order. In fact, what it is the restoration of the Old World Order. The progressive, the Enlightenment is Christ. And they're trying to take us back to the Dark Ages, if you will. And so let me suggest that the French Revolution, the American Revolution, the war that we had with Spanish American Revolution, the war, the World War I, World War II, all of these wars are just actually different chapters of the same thing to change the world and revert it back. And the way that they do it is actually, I would suggest you watch the movie, read the book, The Mouse That Roared. You essentially can take a population, it doesn't matter how big it is. If you can divide it into 50-50, then what happens is that you then have to take a minority and go shift it left or right. And that's what they do. They have to frame you up pretty much 50-50. Men versus women, white versus black didn't cut it. So they threw the women in with the blacks. So they call them all oppressed. Any way they can do that. And then they can basically take down. So we have a situation today, and the same thing is true of Russia. Russia was a Christian country. And the czars are actually good people. They were privatizing the land, and the communists hated them. It was the czars versus communism. They reframed the whole history. And so what they do is they get us fighting ourselves. And we are in a situation today where we are taking ourselves down because of what? Because people are doing their job. They're afraid to get fired. So they do their job. Mm-hmm. And so what happens, you have the few that have seized the termites that have gotten into the top, they're pushing these commands down, and all of a sudden down this pyramid from, judicial decisions, SCOTUS decisions, Nancy Pelosi rants and raves, and they say, okay, tomorrow this is what you have to do. And all of a sudden the sheriffs and the police, everybody who has guns across the country is following their orders. And the hospitals are sitting there following their instructions, CDC. Mm-hmm. what we have to do is realize that I believe is that the only way we are going to get out of this is that part of that equation has to be nullification. Because if we follow these instructions and we just go along because that's what it is, then we're gone. And nullification, people take an oath, people pledge allegiance because it's an individual commitment to uphold the original values of this country. That's why we do it. And the reason that you do it is you pledge is because you're supposed to stand up and yell and scream if something is wrong. You as an individual, you're there to challenge those top-down decisions. And I think that we have to develop a mentality across this country where the good people just say enough. And we have to basically do what's right, not what's, quote, lawful or what SCOTUS tells us to do, but do what's right.
Do you have any comment on that, Matt? Follow up?
No, well put. And I shouldn't try and add to it.
Well, let me ask you this, Matt. So we have the military is sort of a closed system. They have their own military code of justice. They're not really elected. They're sort of appointed, or they enlist and then they move up, or they go to military college and they have an officer. They're officers when they get out. How does the person listening to this broadcast, who are mostly not in the military, how can we as, again, outsiders, because the military is its own entity, how do outsiders, regular civilians, if you will, how do they make an impact on a system that is like that? That's they got all the guns,
right,
and they got their own judicial system and their own military courts. And how do we make an effect? How do we impact that as the population, non-military population? Go ahead.
Yeah. The American people have the sense that, well, what am I supposed to do about it? How can I affect what's happening in the military as a bystander? And, but for a long time, they've been able to place some kind of unchecked implicit trust in the military because they considered it a longstanding bastion of patriotism and conservatism. And that's just simply not necessarily the case. In fact, both of those things are under attack at the moment from within. And so the best answer I can give, there are probably other good answers, is that our elected officials need to be the ones that hold them accountable. There's a reason we elect there's a reason there's a House Armed Services Committee and a Senate Armed Services Committee and a whole host of other committees that you hope. Now, there's a Democrat-controlled Congress right now and administration. This makes this very difficult, but you'd hope that with the right line of questioning, for example, that's public testimony, you'd be able to hold these senior leaders accountable for this kind of activism. Unfortunately, what I saw in the past 6 months, when I've seen both of those committees I mentioned questioning Lloyd Austin, General Mark Milley, Admiral Michael Gilday, of the Navy, and other senior leaders about both some of the failed actions we took in our botched withdrawal from Afghanistan, but also about Marxist-rooted critical race theory. Some of their recommendations, like they've got Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist book on the Navy sailors reading list right now, for example. When pressed about those things, you'd think that you'd be able to tease out some of this, insist on holding them accountable or changing course, otherwise they're out of their seat. But that's not, in fact, what happened. And so if you've got people in the Congress that can't, and I don't want to be a fatalist, but if you've got a broken system where the courts are working against you and your congressmen are working with a kind of impotence, and they can't even hold our military. Our military is accountable to civilian leadership, period, in this country. And so you've got, like you said, appointees, but they're accountable to the Congress and various committees in the Congress, and ultimately to the president's not going to hold them accountable. Certain members of the Congress don't want to touch some of these issues with a 10-foot pole. And so then you've got, in some cases, some weak Republicans who, they drop it after they bring up the questions once, and it doesn't seem to have any staying power. That's why you see these people still sitting in their positions. In fact, that's why I'm interested in seeing a shift enough in the political arena and hopefully in the midterms where you've got some people who are fierce about these issues, about holding our senior military leaders accountable, so that we can actually get rid of people who insist on pushing a political agenda in the military. It doesn't belong there. It just simply doesn't belong. Politics fundamentally shape the military arena, but political activism has no place in the military. And so who's going to hold them accountable? And the American people need to hold their elected officials accountable so our elected officials can hold our senior military leaders accountable. But that's a tough, I understand I'm almost,
it's almost a bridge too far.
That works, but that's a hard order in today's age when our elected officials run amok and aren't even accountable to their constituents. I mean, this is a hard problem to solve. That's why the education piece is important.
The people have got to rise up. The people have got to rise up. I have a question. Let me throw in something completely out.
We got about 2 minutes, just so you know. We got 2 minutes, just so you know, before the show's over. Go ahead, Kirk.
Because I reached the kind of the. I got woke a long time ago. And one of the questions I had was these Air Force base closures. And I've often wondered if those Air Force base closures were intended to basically kind of set up and tee up all this, because if you kind of look, it seems like what they did is they left the air bases to protect the cities, and they took them away from a lot of the rural places. You have a comment on?
I don't. I've not thought about that, so I shouldn't.
Why don't you check it out? Because they closed a lot of air bases.
Yeah, I'm aware of that.
Which ones they closed and where they closed them and which one they kept.
Interesting. Yeah, I've not. I'm aware of that, but I've never thought through that.
We just have about a minute and a half. I want to be able to give you an opportunity to give out your websites again, Matt, and your name of your book, and where can people find your podcast before we go. Over to you.
Well, thanks. It's been a pleasure joining you today. I hope some of what we discussed is useful. They can go on my website, MatthewLohmeier.com, to find out information about the book, also about my forthcoming show, the first episode of which will be available tomorrow, The Matt Lohmeier Show. Lohmeier is spelled Lohmeier, MatthewLohmeier.com. In fact, I hate putting in a plug for this. I might, people had stones, they might throw them at me, but Amazon is actually the cheapest place to get my book right now. I mean, I don't
$3.29.
$3 for a paperback, $5 for
$3.29, and you have nothing but 5-star reviews, 2,200 5-star reviews. That's exceptional.
Yes, sir. Yeah. Fortunately, I was uniquely situated to publish the book and write when I did, and that allowed the word to get out to a lot of people. But there will be another edition of the book coming out in about a month with an updated preface and forward with some information about what's gone on in the military since I published the book.
Fellas, we can hang on after the show and chat for just a minute, but we're just out of time right now here on the network. We appreciate you joining us today, folks. We're delighted to have Lieutenant Colonel Matthew Lohmeier on the show today, and co-hosted by Kirk MacKenzie. CriticalDisclosure.com, TheConstitutionalCounty.com. We'll talk to you tomorrow. Until next time, this is James White for Critical Disclosure Radio saying bye now. Hang on, guys.